Um, yeah, some of the conversion is great. I did start reading version of it.
Yeah, thank you. So the way that I'm going to do this is rather than doing the usual thing, which I do, which is show a lot of slides, I'm actually going to try to do a lot of sort of like examples of the software engineering tasks, because honestly, I think a lot of them are just really more interesting to see live. And of course, this, I'm sure I will fail, run into bugs and other things, but hopefully get across the interesting points and capabilities. And please feel free at any point to stop me with what I'm doing and ask questions or say, well, what if you try that? What happens? That type of thing. I would love to answer any of those questions. And I'm going to probably just share the browser screen that you see right here. And the reason for that is it's probably too hard for me to switch back and forth between all the different screens for doing environment. So I'll get it to generate code. And then if I run something, you'll see me copying and pasting output back to see what happened, but not necessarily going into the editor and using it. And then the other thing just to note is I'm going to focus exclusively on doing all of the work in basically GPT-4. And I would say ChatGPT, but I'm going to use a custom interface to GPT-4. And this is just using the API underneath the hood, but it makes it easier to manage conversations and some things like that that are helpful. So what you're seeing is basically ChatGPT, but it's sort of a custom version or front end to it. So the first thing I want to do is just sort of talk a little bit about what is the easiest thing to do in terms of software engineering with these tools. And the easiest thing to do is something that is sort of transformative in the world of software engineering, which was in the world of software engineering, if you wanted to build the tools for yourself to program something from scratch, you had to be fairly skilled in knowing how to code prior to these tools. And now you don't actually have to understand the code at all, potentially. And I see a question. Yeah, so there's a question on GPT-4 Codex, and I'll follow up on that in 1 second here. And one of the things that's really interesting is when I first started looking at all of the capabilities for using these tools for software engineering, was I kind of had it in the back of my head that this is going to allow for a lot of types of software engineering, just end users themselves, to directly express what they want and go and build themselves software tools. And we had a Vanderbilt alum who works at Raymond James, and she gave me the first evidence from I would say, out in industry that this is true. And I've heard plenty of other examples of this now. And what she told me was that their real estate investment team, or she presented this to my class. So what she presented to the class that Jesse and I teach, was that their real estate investment team had challenged themselves to use ChatGPT for as many things as they could in their workflow, but they couldn't put their data into it. And so they were trying to figure out, what do we do with ChatGPT if we can't put our data into it? And so somebody's like, well, we can bring the computation to our data if we can just get ChatGPT to write the software for us. And so basically that real estate team started going and creating lots of little individual tools for themselves and helpful programs for themselves in Python. And then the whole team started realizing they could all do it. And the whole team started building lots of little useful tools and utilities for themselves in Python. And then they started building web interfaces to things. And they were doing it all through just basically going into ChatGPT and telling it what they wanted and expressing their requirements. And then over time, they started realizing, oh, we need to manage all these things. And how do we manage all this source code? And they started learning basically some of the software engineering process from interacting with ChatGPT. And so I think there is actually absolutely capability to go and build tools from scratch at a small scale with absolutely no prior coding experience, which is something I've been very surprised would be possible in my career. So I'm going to start off with doing that, which is one of the simplest tasks. And I'm going to kind of walk through how I think through it and do it from a prompt engineering perspective. So the first task I'm going to have it do is I'm going to have it create a tool that just goes and takes a zip file full of videos and extracts new videos of the first 30 seconds. And if this is, and I'm picking this task because it's kind of an arbitrary task, but if I had to go and figure it out from scratch, it'd probably take me a bunch of time to do it. So I'm going to say, let me go down here. Please create a Python program that does the following. One, takes the path to a zip file full of videos as a command line parameter. 2, extracts all of the files in the zip file. 3, looks for videos in the extracted files. 4, for each video, extracts the first 30 seconds of the video. 5, copies the videos to a separate new directory. Copies the shorter videos to a separate new directory. So I'm going to start off there.
And Jill's quick question, do you find that numbering sort of helps rather than just sort of like listing all the things that you want, enumerating them sort of helps?
I think it helps me. I don't have concrete evidence that it helps, but I certainly think like making it so I think making it look like step-by-step instructions like chain of thought matters. I mean, I think I think that's well established. Whether or not the numbering matters, I don't know. I think it kind of indicates sequence. So if it is sort of like sequentially thought through, it's probably helpful in laying out the code. But I do it to me just because it like forces me to like think through it sort of sequentially, what I want the code to look like and do. Or if I just think about it from a task-based perspective, thinking about like breaking the task down and then, you know, step by step, how would I go through this? So I don't know. Out of curiosity, Jesse, have you seen any results that say one way or the other if numbering matters?
No, but it occurred to me this can allow for easier, iteration too. You can say, step 2 is not quite right, rather than having to say. So, but I like this a lot because I've not been doing this, but I'm going to start doing this for me.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but because it does give you an identifier to say which one is there. So if I go and put that in, hopefully it'll go through and generate a Python program for me. And I'm sad in some ways because this one is pretty well done from the perspective of it already divided it up into separate functions, and it doesn't always do that. And I was kind of hoping it wouldn't, so I could do some work on it to tell it to do that. But I'll go in the reverse direction of making it less modular in a second. All right, so and somebody asked for copying and pasting the prompt, so I'll copy and paste those as well. So I'll put them in the chat here. So this is the prompt I just used. So it did honestly, it did. So somebody asked the question, how does the LLM know how to make functions? Well, the short version is that it's been trained on all of this internet data, and it would have seen lots and lots of functions in its training data. That's kind of like the high level perspective, is like it certainly encountered Python functions before. Now, how is it so good at it? I can't answer that question because I'm still amazed. Now, how did it decide to do it for this particular request? I think in this case, it was just random. It chose to do it. Now, in fact, we can test it. Let me just make sure I have my, let's see, what's today's date? Make sure I have this open so I can go back to it. So I'll just take the same prompt and we'll probably get, I'm betting if I do it again, because I did it earlier, I was playing around with these tools and I was getting ones without function. So we'll probably get something more procedural, or maybe I just did something special in my prompt that I don't realize. So let's see if we get something different. Nope, getting something very similar. Which is somewhat interesting to me, because I wonder if I did something special in my prompt that I don't even realize that's making it more apt to generate individual functions. Well, now it's kind of creating a much more procedural main function than it had before. So this is kind of a good example. So let me, as soon as it finishes generating. So if you look at this version, which is right here, we can see that like it does have functions to do some of the individual things, but then it has this pretty procedural main function. If we look at the other one, it has more functions and a much more concise main function. And just at a high level, this is kind of like one of the initial things that we've done research on this, and I just want to emphasize it, is like it's so cheap to generate coding solutions. One of the simplest things you can do to improve use of the tool is to get it to do more than one and choose what you like better. And in prior research, one of the things that we did is we would have it generate 100 solutions, and then we would automatically benchmark all of them for performance, and then we would take the best one. And we don't really have tools like that yet, like coding environment tools like that yet, but I think that's like the future, is where you have it automatically give you 10 or 100 different options and automatically check all of them. Now, one of the interesting things is you can then go and have it refactor code. So like, let's look at this one, and let's assume that it produced this one, and for whatever reason, I don't like it stylistically. I think it's like this main function is too procedural and messy. I could just go back and follow up and say, can you please refactor the main? Not that my spelling mistakes matter, but they bother me. Can you please refactor main to make it more modular? And this is, it turns out that they tend to have, or the models tend to have a pretty good sense of what modularity means, and also different design principles. So what we'll probably see it do is extract a lot of that main method into separate functions, which it's doing. And now we've got a much more concise main function. So one of the things I also would encourage you to do is, when you're doing it, is like, you know, if it's generating code that's not, you know, as modular as you would like, or things like that, then just go back and ask. And whatever property it is, you know, whatever non-functional property like modularity or design principles or things like that, that are easy to see structurally from the code, just go back and follow up and ask it to do that. So there are a couple of questions in chat. So one, was there anything special in this system message? Not well. So my system message is not the default ChatGPT system message, because it's for this individual tool. And so my system message is different than the normal system message, but there's nothing special in my system message related to coding. But one thing I would say is that if you use custom instructions and you fill them up with all kinds of things, like make sure the code is modular, and make sure that you break things down into individual functions. And there's lots of things like that, that if you end up asking for them over and over in the code, and you're using ChatGPT, you can just go and move them into custom instructions. And then, yeah, and so Jesse has a good point. So somebody asked a question about interfaces with specialized hardware. Yeah, Jesse's absolutely right. Using documentation, and this also just for anything that you do, like newer APIs, newer libraries, or things that it wasn't trained on. So like a great example of this is I could probably go to LangChain, which is, you know, probably not trained on. Actually, I should go to LangChain docs or documentation. Actually, let me go to their API, find somewhere where it's easy to cut and paste. Let's see, LangChain documentation, or LangChain coding examples. Honestly, the thing that I find the best and is the easiest is to give it examples of code. And it can learn from examples very, very well, which is Jesse's got a lot of experience in how well it learns from examples. If I can find a quick section of well, I may not be able to find a good, oh, here we go. Here's some of their samples. Let's take this text summary one. Oh no, that's a Python notebook. Well, the short version is like if you have a good set of examples, that's a Streamlit app. I don't want to do that. I can see if I can find one. If you have documentation or you have sample code and you simply go and provide it in your prompt, it can learn the API very quickly. So let me just see one last time. Let's see, LangChain, or let's see, OpenAI calling the completions API in Python. Let me just find and I don't know if OpenAI did this on purpose, but a lot of their stuff is easier to, they have a lot of examples here. So let's go for like this, for transcription using audio transcriptions in their API. So if I went back to here, say now using the following OpenAI documentation on the transcript API, please add the ability to automatically extract transcripts from each of the shorter videos. And so all I'm doing is giving it the task, and then I'm pasting in a sample of how to do it. And I think I've got enough context for it to be able to do this. So it looks like it's working out. It's imported OpenAI correctly now. And it's possible that the OpenAI is somehow baked into it now, but I'm fairly certain. I mean, this works for arbitrary APIs if you can find the right examples. You can paste documentation in, although I find code examples are the better thing. So if you have like a coding example or set of coding examples that kind of demonstrate roughly what you want it to do, and you copy and paste them in, then it works pretty well. And so now we're getting the transcribe audio, and it looks like it's done a good job of taking the whole thing and adding that capability into it. And let's see, it looks like now it probably needed to extract an MP3 from this, and I'm not sure that it did it looking at the code. So like this probably would be something that if I went and ran it, it's assuming it looks like that there is an MP3 file in here. So I would just, knowing that it's expecting an MP3 file, it looks like what it's doing right here is it's expecting that there's an MP3 file named after the video. And I would just follow up and say, please don't assume that the MP3 exists. Please extract it from the video and then pass it to the transcription API. And so I would just follow up and tell it what I want to do, and how what's sort of flawed in its sort of assumptions. And that's kind of the other thing that's really helpful in this, is always thinking about, like, basically what I'm doing in the prompt is I'm giving it requirements. The other thing that I tend to try not to do is, in general, I do my best not to directly edit the code. And there's a couple reasons for this. So one is that I find that I'm faster if I don't edit the code unless it's a small change. But one of the problems that you'll run into is, like, the only context that it knows is what's going on in the conversation, like this right here. And if I go and I copy and paste over into my editor and then I begin changing the code, now that what's going on in my editor and what the code it has is going to be different. And the context that it's using to work is going to be different than the code, the context that's actually in my editor. And what happens really fast is I find myself doing more work because it starts generating code that doesn't have my edits in it. So then I have to go and I have to copy and paste my code back from the editor back into ChatGPT and say, this is my updated code. Now, based on this version, go and do it. And so by the time I'm done doing that back and forth, I find it's just more efficient to directly tell it what I want it to do differently. Now, I also have a slight advantage because in this custom interface, it has a tool that I wish was in the ChatGPT interface and saves me so much time, which is if it generates code and it has some very small error or problem, I have the ability to edit it and just fix the code directly from its response. So I can actually edit its response so that in the follow-up context, but that's not in the standard ChatGPT. So in general, if it doesn't do something exactly right, then I'll go and tell it to fix it. Now, one of the questions that I want to address that was in there was experience doing test-driven development with ChatGPT. I'm wondering if you write tests first and then use said tests for functions. So it turns out, based on very, very early experiments that one of the PhD students in my software engineering with AI class is doing, that if you give it the tests in the prompts, it does a better job of generating code, meaning that there's a higher percentage chance. And I say it's very preliminary because it's not published yet and we haven't run it to ground yet, but it looks like if you give it the prompt of what you want it to do, plus you give it tests, that it gives you better code in general across a couple of metrics. And so I think in general, if you have the tests, you can think of it as it's basically like a more detailed specification of your requirements. And so it's more likely to be able to accurately predict what you want. Now, we've also done experimentation, and he did some initial experimentation where if you give it just the tests and try to have it intuit what you want, it actually doesn't perform that well. But if you have the combination of prompt, like human description and the tests, it tends to work really well. So one of the other things that's really helpful, just thinking through it, is like, when you're going and editing and working with it, if it does generate something that's not quite right, a lot of times what you don't want to do is try to have it regenerate everything from scratch, because then it'll sometimes go and change things that you liked previously. And so a lot of times what I'll do is there's something I don't like, I might go and just copy and paste the exact function and be like, please change this function. And I would paste it in, and then I might say something like, make it so that the API key is a variable that is passed in. And I might go do that and do something like that. So if I want to force it to not go and edit the rest of the file and mess with everything else, a lot of times I'll try to give it a more concrete, narrower context. And sometimes it'll go and still manage to change other things. But in this case, it's kind of nice because it's also figuring out what other parts of the file need to be changed, and it's automatically updating them. Yeah, I see a hand up.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful overview. I have a question. I'm not sure if you might have touched on it earlier in the beginning. I came in a little late. At times when you're interacting with ChatGPT, there's an error or something. It won't continue to generate anymore. You get that little red text there.
Yeah.
At that point, what is the best way to proceed? Because you can refresh, but sometimes it just will not continue that session. Do you just like select all and copy what you've done, or take the last few selections? How do you continue a session that was really useful, but will no longer generate on that session?
A great question. So it kind of depends. Like if you're lucky and you get the regenerate button for just the last response, then that's usually the best thing, is to just hit regenerate. But you're still kind of stuck with the fact that it might just start over on its answer. You can also take, if you like what it did, sometimes this works. So like, if I just take this and I copy, let's say it stopped right before it did this process videos thing and I got an error. Often what you can do is just copy where it stopped if you liked it, and then just go back, and you can do this in ChatGPT and edit your response and just include that at the bottom. And then it'll a lot of times just pick up where it left off. Because
That's really helpful.
yeah, so because it's basically doing that anyways in the conversation. It's just sort of looking at all the messages. So sometimes you can just copy and paste and get it to kickstart it again. Doesn't always work, but a lot of times it works. This also can work if you're using ChatGPT advanced data analysis. One of the things that's super duper helpful, because it times out after a while, because it's constantly, and I'll show that in a second, maybe if I have time here. It's constantly writing software, executing it, but it has like this virtual environment that it's doing it in. And if you don't interact enough with it, the environment times out and then it loses all of your work. And it's really infuriating. So having done some very long conversations with it, it's really infuriating. And so one of the things you can do is, like, as it's going through and doing work, you can ask it to save a summary of the conversation up to this point of like what you did, and like kind of like write itself a note almost. And then save intermediate files as it's going. And then to start a new conversation, you can give it its sort of summary that it produced of what it did plus other stuff. So like right now, this is actually kind of, yeah, you somehow managed to get it to break itself. So it's stopped for someone, it's hung, and I'm gonna have to I'm probably gonna have to refresh here. So well, actually I guess did it complete, or did I lose the message completely? No, I think it completed. No, so I guess I lost what I had, but yeah, if you can go back and just copy and paste, a lot of times that'll work. So one of the other things that I think is really useful, so this is really, really helpful. The other thing, like if you're doing this at a high level, is like, especially if you're working in something that you're not as familiar with, is just to say like, please generate a detailed README for how this code is architected and how to use it. Please include installation, instructions, configuration, etc. And so this can be a really, really helpful thing. Like this is also like one of the tasks that like I hate doing oftentimes as software engineering. I get lazy, I create the code, but then I don't want to do this piece of it, which then is usually invaluable if I bothered to spend the time to do it in the first place, because I'll come back to the tool at some point in time and have forgotten how to do it. And this is like the simplest helpful thing to do, is just get it to generate the README, and don't forget to do this because it's so useful. And so this is giving like probably a way more detailed README than I would ever have sat down and written for this little utility. But if I ever go back to it, I will be so happy this exists. Now, the other thing I would say that I've learned my lesson on is the conversations themselves become valuable sort of development artifacts. And so like if you're using ChatGPT and you get done developing some artifact, going and using the share link and capturing that conversation and then having it somewhere, like, when I built this feature, like here's the conversation I had to do it. And like I find it helpful to be able to go back and look at, why was it designed that way? What was I trying to do? There's a whole conversation. It's kind of like a thought process around like what this has. So my prompt for the README was, and I'll paste this in here. And then, having that link can be really, really helpful. The other thing that's really helpful is just telling it to go back and comment its code really detailed. So like, please comment this code and be very, very detailed, and telling it to be like really detailed or whatever you want. You can kind of like, help it, but this can be really, really useful, especially if you're not completely sure what on earth it's doing. or you want to kind of get like a high level sense, just going and taking blocks of code, telling it to do a better job of commenting them. And I mean, honestly, like right here, this is like way more verbose than I would ever comment in my life. And I'm not sure I would do this, but it's super useful sometimes if you want to kind of understand exactly what the code is doing, how it's doing it, or if you really need this level of like sort of commenting, you can actually go and do it. And it's really, really helpful. And this one may be going on forever. Okay, there he goes. But you can see like it took a very small function and it commented it in a level of detail that never in my life am I probably going to write that level of commenting. But it's like a great use case, simple thing. The other thing you can do and really quickly is just say, please generate a test case for this function. And writing test cases is also something that it can do typically really well. And so if you honestly, when you're working with it to generate code, a lot of times it's like it makes sense to just generate the test cases because you can get it to generate a bunch of test cases, then you can see it working. And then I'll normally go and do like the actual sort of like ad hoc experimentation with it separately, but I'll let it do a lot of the test case generation. And sometimes, what I find is that it is, particularly if I tell it generate 20 test cases or 15 test cases, it can be more sort of comprehensive and thoughtful for it than I am. Now, in this case, I don't know if the test case is very easy to generate, but you also notice one other thing, and that is that as long as you're following up in the conversation, it's going to create a lot of context. And so I told it to be really detailed in the commenting up here, and it's essentially carrying over down here. So now it's sort of thinking that I want a lot of commenting. And so I'm getting a lot of commenting on here. So one of the things also just to think about is like, as you sort of like in the conversation kind of express what you want from requirements and code perspective, you'll probably start seeing that show up in the other code as well, like that comes later in the conversation. Now, one of the other things that's interesting, I may be too far down in the conversation to do this, but I'll try to give it a shot in the other conversation here, is you can also, one of the things I think is underappreciated in it is it's pretty good at understanding design principles and sort of like high level design concepts. So I'm going to say, please refactor the code to separate pure and impure functions. I want to be able to easily test my business logic. So it has a concept of a lot of these high level things, and it can do a pretty good job of refactoring code. So pure and impure functions would be things like functions that are just pure logic and they don't have a side effect, like creating a file or like, copying a video or something like that. These would just be like simple things that don't affect the file system, don't affect a database like that. And then impure functions would be things that like have a side effect, like the networking or the talking, adding data to the database, anything that's going to create some persistent change. And so I'm not sure actually if this code has anything that's pure, so it may not work. I don't know. We'll see what we get.
Tools to think. Oh, so I think Dr. Yao had a question, and then there's one good question in the, well, there are lots of good questions in the chat, but the question in the chat was, how long do you have before the context begins to expire, when you run out of context? How do you tell when that begins to happen, and how do you deal with that?
So the way that I normally tell that it's expired is I usually see things happening that I'm like, it forgot. Now I don't know how to easily tell in the, like, when it's about to happen in the conversation other than to experience it. Although I'm curious if you have a solution to this, Jesse, because I don't really know how to spot it, but I spot it when it gives me an error where I'm like, it forgot. I told it not to do that, or I told it to change this thing, and
I would say, well, shortly you'll have 128K, so it'll be very unusual to run out of context. But yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, it can be pretty subtle, on what it begins to lose. One thing that comes to mind though, which I've not done though, is kind of like putting a little test in there. If you're really limited by context length, you could certainly put some information up there and just probe it and see if it knows it. Once it forgets, that you're out of context length. I've never done that before. It's occurred to me right now.
So I just did a test based on what you said, Jesse. I just said, what is the very first sentence that I provided you? And it says, please create a Python program that does the following, which we go up to the top.
So, answer is you didn't run out. Now, of course, by adding that question, now you might have run out.
That's true. That's true. I may have just tipped it over the
pushed it over the edge.
Just seeing what you just wrote, did it just interpret what your question was by adding first? Because I don't see that you said what is the very first sentence. You just said what is the very sentence that I provided you.
Oh yeah,
and then it answered the very first sentence you provided me was.
Yeah, you're right. It saw through my mistake and fixed it. Now the other interesting question is, if I change this, will we get a different result? No, okay, so it clearly understands what the first message is. So I haven't run out of context yet. So that's an interesting one. I'm going to start a new conversation. I know because we're quickly going in time. There's a couple of really interesting things that I think are useful that I want to show. So one is, if you're building lots of types of applications, like web applications in particular, I just think this is such an interesting one. So the thing I think is really valuable and underappreciated with these tools is to start them earlier in the process, like when you're actually creating requirements and design and things like that. So I'm going to start off with, please help me create the requirements for a tool to transcribe video, or transcribe, let's see, tool to create transcriptions of video. I want to provide the videos as a zip file. I want to have a web API to do this. So it'll go and start writing a lot of requirements, and this can be really helpful for thinking through, like, what are all the different features it should have, things like that. Now I'm going to just stop this here, because like typically I wouldn't want them written out like this. I would want them as like something like user stories. So I would just go back and say, please provide the requirements as user stories. And, giving whatever format you want is kind of nice, because then it'll go and like automate a lot of the initial like brainstorming. It can help just like figure out like, what on earth should this do? What should like the requirements look like? Things like that. And this may go on way too long, so I may cut it off in a second here, because it may be really verbose, and it typically is in requirements generation, which is part of the reason it can be really useful, because it can help you think through what this could look like. So I'm going to let it finish this one, and I'm just going to cut it off. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, please create an open API specification for a HTTP interface that implements these requirements. So this is one of the things I think is really, really useful, is like having it brainstorm and work with it to create requirements, and then having it create like specifications for these types of things. Because these are also things like, I always try to focus on the things I really don't want to do myself, or I would end up being, I would run off and just go in the code, and there's these other artifacts that are really valuable if you create them up front or think through them better. So things like this can be really useful. So it's now going through and building the specification for it. So it's taking my requirements. Well, it's actually its requirements. I didn't do any work this time because I didn't interact with it, but it's writing the open API specification. And basically this is a specification for a REST interface or basically like a web API interface. And it's a well-known language that it's obviously seen. It's writing the interface for it and translating it into an interface that you can work with programmatically. And now I could take this and I actually have like a starting point of how I might go about implementing this. And I could iterate with it and tell it what I don't like or I want to change, but it's actually done a good job on sort of the first pass of designing this thing. So we have the upload path, we have status of different tasks, we have transcriptions, and we can get a different task ID, and all of that should correspond back to its initial requirements. But like one of the cool things is like the speed at which I got from idea to a set of requirements to a specification is like much, much greater. And so I can start playing around and thinking more about the design aspect of like, well, what would it look like if I added this requirement, or what would my API look like? And I could say, you know, please give me a completely different API design. And like, I just get for free, roughly for free. I just have to wait for it to do it again. You know, it will come back and give me a totally different design for the API that I can start thinking through it. And honestly, I think as a, you know, one of the things I'm big on as a human being is I don't want to like get rid of myself. I want to make sure I'm thinking through all of it. So one thing, a simple way to always be engaged and in the loop is to make it give you options. And then you're forced to think through which of the options do you like better and why. And so like more and more when I'm using the tool, not only because it's valuable to see different outputs, and we even saw with the code that it generated, if you get it to generate twice, you'll get two different sets of code and you may like one better than the other. But it also kind of makes you think about like, what is it I like better about one or the other? And that can also help you think about like, what is the design that I like better for the, you know, for one versus the other. Now, the other thing that I can do that's really interesting is I can say, please simulate this API. I am going to type in HTTP requests, and you will respond with the HTTP response that the API that I am invoking would produce. Make sure and provide 404, etc. if I do something wrong. Okay, so now I need to go back up and look at its API. So I'm going to just pretend like I know what this thing is. So I'm going to say get, and I'm going to fill in a fake ID for a video because usually it'll play ball with me. And like I can start experimenting with the API, and these are all like what the API response would look like for that thing if I'd actually probably started implementing it. But I can start experimenting with it and thinking about like, how is this thing going to work? So if I went and I said like, let's say I want to go and pretend interacting with it, I could say, you know, post /videos, and then you can create kind of like comments of like what you want the request to look like. Provide some simulated data going to the API. So somebody asked the question, what does simulating mean here? If the underlying code has a bug, will it still run? It's not actually running code. It's just read my specification up here. Well, actually not my specification. It generated the specification over here, and it's pretending to be an HTTP server that implements that specification. There is no code. This is not actually executable. This is just a description of an API that has not been created. And it's simulating what a web server that had that API would do if you sent those requests. So there's no actual code that's being created here. It's just the model itself is pretending to be a web server that has that API. So like now that I've got it responded and it's telling me like, okay, well, if you'd done it correctly, this is what the response would have looked like. Which we went and checked its API, it should match up. But I'm going to go back to this now that I've got a valid video ID. And I'm going to say like 1, 2, 3. Now, the purpose of this is not to be perfect. the purpose of this thing is to kind of get a rough sense and kind of experiment with what it would look like.
So the neat thing about code is that if it does hallucinate something, you'll know because it won't work. Where should you be on the lookout for areas that it's likely to hallucinate in your code? Is it more about using code and languages that are less familiar, or is it, oh, usually it's the variables that it likely gets wrong? Are there certain things that you should pay more attention to, or is it the comments? Which are the areas that are more prone to hallucination, if any?
So my experience is like, so first I would say, like, if you're using Python or JavaScript or Java, it's probably going to give you really solid code that compiles and runs. The places where it's more likely to make a mistake is it will try to, like, its cutoff date is always going to be later than the current versions of libraries. So the place where you can run into challenges is like, it generates code that targets an older version of a library. And then the newer version of the library got changed in some way that it doesn't have information on. And so it generates code that you're using the newer version of the library, but it's generating code for an older version of the library. And so they're incompatible. And so then you have to go back and you either have to feed it the documentation, like Jesse mentioned earlier, give it the documentation so it can learn what the updated version looks like, or you have to make sure that when you're creating the code that it's using the version of a library that you want. And versions and things like that in library are harder for it, in my experience, to understand, like, contextually. The other place that I've seen just lots and lots of hallucination in is not necessarily in the code itself, but in the libraries, when it's like, if you ask it to generate the file that specifies the libraries that are needed for this code, and it has versions, and you tell it to do the specific versions, a lot of times the versions that it generates, like the version numbers, are just non-existent, or just like hallucination. But in this example, well, actually, if I'll go back over here. In this example, like when it's saying pip install OpenAI, that's totally valid, or sudo apt-get install ffmpeg, like those things to install libraries. They don't have a version number with them. The library is well known. Those things it gets right. But if it like says ffmpeg this specific version, a lot of times it'll get those things wrong. But the code itself, in my experience, is really, really good. Now, I used to do a lot of programming in Clojure. It's a more obscure language, and it would generate Clojure code that worked, but stylistically, I hated the code, and no amount of prompting could get it to kind of, or I take that back. I gave up too quickly, probably, but like, it took a lot of effort to get it to generate code that I liked stylistically. And sort of the way I would explain it is, it generated Clojure code that looked like a Python programmer wrote it. And so it wrote code that wasn't sort of stylistically the way you would do things in that language. And so, stylistic things are other things that can, like, whether or not you get it. But the other thing that's really important is, like, the thing you really, really want to pay attention to is, like, it's going off of your prompt, and your prompt is basically a set of requirements for the software that you're writing. And often your requirements are way less specified than you think. And it fills, its goal is to, like, fill in the blanks, right? And try to get something that works. And so you want to be really specific. So the first prompt I used, I was trying to be as detailed as possible, step by step, what I wanted to do. If you start off with something more high level and you don't give it kind of enough detail, you're probably not going to get, exactly what you want. Or like when I followed up with the code about, I want you to transcribe the videos. The first time it just said, it assumed that there was already an MP3 file in the zip file. And I didn't tell it, is there an MP3 file? Is there not one? I didn't specify from that. So it just made a best guess, basically. But that wasn't what I wanted from a requirements perspective. So that's the thing that's really important to follow up on.
And the other thing to keep in mind too is if the language is not as well specified. So for example, if you try to get it right to write R, the R is terrible because it'll mix and match from tidyverse and base R. And there's so many different ways of writing R because it's been around for so long. As opposed to Python, there's a Pythonic way to write, and more object oriented or not. So with R, you get terrible code unless you're very specific. Use tidyverse. You give it more specification of how you want it to code. And Clojure, I wonder if you could have gotten better Clojure if code if you said, please, write, functionally,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It probably could, and I probably am guilty of abandoning ship too quickly. So I will say the other part that was challenging for me in Clojure is a lot of times, like Clojure, I feel like takes more time to read, and it can be trickier to like it takes time to be able to look at Clojure code and really understand what it's doing and how. And I had a harder time reading its Clojure code and understanding what it was doing. And there's probably a way that I could have prompted for that, but I kind of I just took the easy way out and abandoned ship for Python and haven't looked back, unfortunately. So
Along those lines, with regards to it understanding different languages and the best way to pursue it, apologies if you touched on this already, but what would be the benefit of using Code Interpreter versus a dedicated programming interface like GitHub Copilots and things like that?
yeah, great question. Well, so I think the answer is I'll just switch over there real quick. So if you go into advanced data analysis, I think it's really good for, I think it's really good for what it says, like advanced data analysis. Like if you go and do data stuff in it, or if I just take, let me see if I can find some random files. I'll just take some random files and I'll say, please propose a folder structure for these files, and then zip them up in the new folder structure so that I can download the organized files. So this is a task of pretty good. It's all about sort of automation one-off on this task. And so it'll end up writing some, please proceed. If you have kind of ad hoc stuff, I think advanced data analysis is really good. And so it can take my random files and it'll go and write code. So this is what it's doing right now, is it's writing the code basically to, we had the error. Let's get it again. So it's writing the code basically to do this, and then it's going to execute it for me and generate the zip file. Why is Code Interpreter erroring out? This may be the the demo. This is also why I typically don't do live stuff with ChatGPT, is because things like this happen. But right when I need to do it, it decides it's going to stop working. So one-off tasks are really good in advanced data analysis. The kind of downside of it is that they're less repeatable. So if you want to go and have something that's totally repeatable as a tool, having it write Python code and then save it and run it separately is really good. But if you do it in advanced data analysis, if you're going to do it one time, then going through and interactively doing the task itself, if the task itself is more important and whether or not it's repeatable doesn't matter, then I would go into advanced data analysis, organizing these files or generating a one-off visualization of one data set. But if I need to go and generate that exact same visualization over and over again, I'll go and work in ChatGPT probably and get it to write the code to generate the visualization and run it separately. Or if it's just too much data or something like that won't fit within the bounds of resource bounds of advanced data analysis, I'll go and do that. The other thing you can do if you get to the end of a conversation with advanced data analysis that you is you can always tell it to turn this conversation into a Jupyter notebook, or turn this conversation into a Python program so that I can repeat this process with new files. and like it can take all of the work it did and kind of like turn it into a Python program that you can then download, so you can kind of repeat the process you did in advanced data analysis, but separately. And I need to go back before we run out of time to this question about codecs. So I think that anecdotally, and I don't know if this is true, I find that GPT-4 is better for most coding tasks. Now, the Copilot stuff that you get directly baked in the editor is good, I feel like, for sometimes it can be useful because it like has context in the editor itself and can just make it more convenient. But if it's like any type of more complex thing or larger chunk of code, my sort of anecdotal experience, but I don't have any concrete evidence for this, is that GPT-4 is better. And so I will typically do larger coding tasks in ChatGPT, in GPT-4, and then smaller coding, like if just like on the fly stuff inside of the editor with Copilot. And yeah, so that's typically how I decide it.
And I'll toss something in there. Charobel really likes to use VS Code with Code GPT. You kind of get a little bit of both worlds, you know, where it's like you're in an IDE, you get all that. The Code GPT isn't necessarily aware of everything in the IDE, but you kind of get both. You can do sort of the whole system stuff, the refactoring, and you can also do that function level kind of programming where you're sort of iterating. And also Cursor is that somebody mentioned before is also really interesting.
Yeah, and just looking back in the conversations, there were two other questions. So one was, how did we get this interface? So this is we took an open source interface, the one that's over here. We took, where is it? Here it is. We took an open source interface. We extended it with a bunch of new capabilities and features, which actually didn't show a bunch of them, but hopefully it'll be available within Vanderbilt in the near future. It's sort of being discussed and probably piloted soon. And then the other question was, for the simulation I did I actually generate code? And I did not actually generate any code. So this has no code. It's just basically taking the specification itself and simulating how it would work without actually generating any code. Only VU, I don't know, I can't speak for VUMC because as I'm in VU, so maybe if we're successful in VU and people like it, you know, maybe it'll go other places. Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time. I'm also happy to answer any questions that people have via email. I'll just paste my email into chat here. So feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to answer them. And yeah.
Thank you all so much for all your questions and your comments and suggestions. This will be available on our YouTube channel, the Data Science Institute YouTube channel, and we'll send out that link to everybody. It's in the chat. There's also interest in getting a copy of the chat, so we'll send that out as well. So thank you all very much for your time and great questions.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.